Hello, welcome. My name is Tracey Tokuhama-Espinosa. I'm speaking to you from here in Quito, Ecuador. Welcome to week 7, language. This week we're going to be focusing on a lot of different topics or sub-areas of language. First, we're going to quickly review the goals of this particular unit, and then talk about the origins and the evolution of human language. Then we're going to consider some of the different variations in human language, as well as the development of language in children. And in part 2, we're going to actually have a good look at bilingualism and multilingualism, which is a particularly favorite topic of mine. Just as a quick reminder, the resources for this course, the extra readings, as well as the backup PowerPoints can be found within the course room. To start, what were the goals, or what are the goals of this unit? Basically, we have 4 key goals. One previous goal, one is to understand basically where did human language come from in an evolutionary sense, and then to understand how does a person's first language actually develop, where does that come from. Then we're going to look at clarifying the concepts of critical versus sensitive periods in language development, and then on to identifying characteristics of specific language impairments, what problems can occur. And then from there, part 4, which would be the second video we're going to look at, will be to explain the important features of bilingualism and multilingualism by sort of taking apart the myths of multilingualism and considering key factors that do influence successful language learning. To do this, we'd want to look at some guiding questions. Hopefully this will help sort of focus in on the types of the key elements or key concepts that we want to look at in this particular unit. First, we want to ask ourselves, is learning language natural? Is it actually natural? Is it something that the brain can't help but do? And if that's so, what are the minimum requirements needed to actually stimulate language development? We also want to have a look at whether or not, what is the context of the world right now? Is most of the world actually monolingual? When would it be recommended to learn a foreign language? And for those of you who are already bilingual or multilingual, what have been the key factors that have actually influenced your own language learning? So basically, to begin, we'd like to actually have a look at what is the purpose? What is the purpose of language? Many people, if you ask yourself this question, now you might have a first think that it's actually just to communicate. We're going to look a little bit deeper into the idea that maybe language actually facilitates the way we can actually work together, that we can actually create as societies or as a species. So I'd like to take a little bit of an extension on this idea of just general communication and make it go a little bit further, hopefully. To define this, Chomsky and colleagues, they like to put language into the context of actually being a culturally specific system. It's basically set up with a bunch of rules that are agreed upon by a certain society, a group of people in a cultural context. So there's a very, very strong link between culture and language. And later on we're also going to talk about thought and how might thought be bound by the languages that you might know. And we're also going to have a little look at this concept of inner language or inner speech, something that we saw in week 3 related to Vygotsky's concept of where, how we use words to actually come up with the thinking or the limits of our cognition. So let's start off with looking at the origins of human language. We know that there's a general debate about whether or not other species, other animals actually have language. But let's sort of break it down and hopefully if I can try to convince you that all animals can communicate. We know that that's true. But humans are actually the only animal that actually has language. We can see this, as far as, chasing Dr. Doolittle or actually trying to think, well, can we talk to the animals? I'm sure we can communicate with them, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are actually speaking back to us. To illustrate some of the key aspects of language that distinguish humans from other animals, we're going to have a quick look at a video. It's about 7 minutes long. I hope you'll bear with me. Thanks.
Human beings have a lot in common with other species. We all reproduce and take care of our offspring. So a lot of the things that any species does during any given day is going to be similar. We're all trying to get food and shelter and so forth. Human beings communicate like other animals do. But we communicate in very different ways than other animals do.
these truths to be self-evident.
Well, I'm not a crook.
The thing that most distinguishes us from other animals is the sophistication of our language and what that allows us to do culturally.
In Spanish, there are different ways of saying the word love. Te quiero or te amo.
There's a word called menao, which is like a sour, rotting smell.
If I'm eating a pasta dish or something else, I may make a comment in Italian because you can feel the flavor of it in that particular language.
There are lots of species that have some kind of communication system, but there's no species that can talk about the future,
One small step for man.
talk about abstractions, use language as a sort of way of transmitting cultural information, talking about technology, talking about the details of what people's plans are for the future.
I have a dream.
Language is partly in the vocal cords if you have a spoken language, or partly in the hands, but mostly it's in the brain. The thing that allows us to learn language is this complicated interconnected network of a whole bunch of different regions of the brain. Language demands that most of the brain get involved.
The Imaging Center at Columbia University is a research center that is aimed toward understanding the basic neural circuitry of how the brain works. We are able to image the human brain while it's working and see the parts that are engaged in specific processes. Language is one of the functions that is uniquely human. And so understanding the neural circuitry that underlies language is extremely important.
Okay, Glenn. Just slide down a little bit.
The first step in understanding how the brain is organized and how it works is to develop a task that people can do in the scanner that allows us to illuminate those parts of the brain that are actually engaged.
So Glenn, how are you doing?
I'm okay.
Are you all comfy? Okay, great.
Okay, here we go.
Actually lock onto an area. So as these small areas of the brain become active, they actually recruit blood. Just walk right in there. And it's the oxygen in the blood that modifies our signal. Yeah, excellent, excellent. Look at that. With the baseline activity, baseline activity, baseline activity. Beautiful. The study of language requires many different tests of language. And language is a very complicated function. As I'm sitting here talking to you, my brain is engaged in a multiplicity of processes. The first is that I'm conceptualizing what I want to say to you. I have that organized in some fashion in my brain. I listen to myself talk. I modulate what I'm about to say based on what I have just said. And if one could put me in the scanner and image this system, you would see a complex array of actions and reactions in my brain just to communicate the thoughts to you that I am.
So Glenn, what we're going to do is a simple picture naming task. Your job is, when you see the pictures, to name what you see in your head.
Here we go.
And so there's no such thing as one image of the language system. There is an image of the language system doing object naming.
Cactus, pretzel. I don't know what you're called, but some people use them to count. What is that thing called?
In Xanadu did
There is an image of the language system doing passive listening.
where Alf the sacred river ran through caverns measureless.
There is an image of the language system working on problems and high-level decision-making. And so the language system can be revealed through an orderly sequence of specific tasks that we use to probe it.
Do you have any trouble with any of the tasks?
Not at all.
Our tests suggest that the language system incorporates a toolbox, if you will, an array of tools. Each of these tools performs a specific part of the language function. But if you activate one part of the complex whole, it appears that there's a readiness to activate the entire language network.
I speak English and a little Thai.
English, Bengali, and Spanish. English and Russian.
Of course, we're very interested in what makes the language system of the human unique. And so there are numbers of hypotheses that we and others are exploring. One of the hypotheses is that the human brain is more interconnected than non-human primates, for example. So although the brains look very similar, the parts of the brain may not be connected in quite the same way.
Humans are sort of like chimpanzee 2.0 or something like that. Humans are adaptations from something like chimpanzees. And our brains are built on some fairly complicated machinery that's already there. So language actually draws on a lot of mechanisms that were shaped over a long period of time and then kind of builds on top of them.
Ask not what your country...
So it's sort of like it's icing on a cake that was in the oven for a long time. But the icing is really important.
Created each. Celebrate myself.
As Dr. Hurst was showing us, basically all, and Dr. Marcus as well, we're showing a lot of how other animals might be able to communicate, but they basically don't have language in the way that we do, the way humans do. And the second huge point is that the brain is basically wired to be able to conduct sophisticated thought through language and using a great variety of different mechanisms within the brain. We know that this has absolutely nothing to do necessarily with size. Size isn't everything. So you have elephants with huge brains, but they can't really speak. This has something to do with something beyond brain anatomy that actually helps us or helps human beings be able to speak in the way they do. There's this concept of human beings as the third chimpanzee or the third ape, basically. We know that after we branched off from orangutans and there was this general connection with bonobos, gorillas, and chimpanzees, we're very, very similar to them, but they still can't speak. Well, we can speak. We have a much more sophisticated way of communicating. Even though we can transmit communicative signals through visual expression, it's not the same as actually using words. And if you look at how the mechanism functions within vocal communication, it's pretty much the same in other primates, but you'll find differences in a very distinct way. It's something much more physical related to the larynx. We actually know that the way the human mouth actually got shorter and actually the larynx got actually longer. And so because of this, the way that sounds are processed in the brain actually uses a lot more real estate in the brain to actually pronounce things or to talk. We also know that because of the way that the voice box developed in human beings, humans, here's Jane Goodall, she can speak like the ape, but the ape can't speak like she can because she has the benefit of a specialized voice box. So we know because of this prolonged pharynx here, and then because of the voice box, we are able to speak and to use and to have a greater variety of sounds than other primates. I'd like to highly recommend that you watch the BBC video that's mentioned on this particular slide. It's a little bit long for our video right now, so I'm going to skip it, but I hope that you do take the time to come back to it. We also know that it has, going back to the point about it not being necessarily related to brain space or size. We know that, for example, Neanderthal man had a bigger brain than a modern man has. So we know it doesn't have to do necessarily with the mass of the brain, but rather the connections that are occurring within the brain. But something even more interesting and maybe calls our attention to how is it that we were able to develop language and other primates weren't, might have to do more with a genetic makeup. We know that other primates have 48 chromosomes. We have just 46. Now you'd say, well, how can having less be more? There is a concept of basically fusioning. So there could have been a point where we had, where we came from the apes. We actually at some point there was a fusion of two different chromosomes into one. And that could have potentiated what we know to be language. We have identified, we believe that there's a gene for human language, or at least we recognize that in the absence of this gene, there is no language. So we know that when there isn't the presence of FOXP2, we don't have language. So we presume that because of that gene, we are able to speak. Okay, so now we're going to turn from basically the origins of why we have human language in the first place to the variation in human language. There's roughly 2,500 to 6,000 languages out there in the world. There's about 2,500 pure languages, and then when you count Pidgin, Creoles, dialects, then it bumps up to more, a bit over 6,000 different varieties. They're divided into families, so you can see that, for example, in this color-coded bar, there's Celtic languages, there's Italic languages, there's different languages that are Germanic-based, so these are only European languages, for example, on this particular chart, but we know that there's something to the history of languages. They can grow up together, say, for example, Latin-based languages, so Italian, Spanish, French. If you grow up with, or these languages historically grew up together, so they have very, very similar grammatical structures, they share verb bases, so basically we know that people who know one of these languages, sometimes they're mutually intelligible. For example, if you know Spanish, you can listen to Italian, you can pretty much catch almost everything. Same thing with Portuguese. We also know there's a second way that languages are related, and that has to do with a linguistic categorization or typologies, which we'll look at in just a second. But just to illustrate, basically around the world, there of these 2,500 languages, or these 6,000 different languages and dialects and pidgins and creoles, we see that there's a dominance. It doesn't have to do with basically where they are in the world, because we know, for example, that Mandarin is the most highly spoken first language, but it's only spoken in China, basically. So we realize that it's not a geographical necessary limitation. It's the more land you have, the more people who speak the language, not at all. It has more to do with actually popular use. It has to do with economics, commerce, and a lot of other things, social media. But we'll look at that in just a second. Some examples, for example, of families of languages would be within the European range. So, for example, within the Latin-based languages, you have French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian. Within the Dutch or the Germanic languages, you have German, English, Dutch, Danish, Swedish. So there's certain languages that are connected to each other through historical roots. There's some other examples from all around the world. There's just different groupings that we have. And then we have a second type of grouping that are types of families of languages that have to do with linguistic typology. All languages have verbs, subjects, objects. And if you have three things, you can basically combine them in 6 different ways, right? But for some reason, all human languages, or most human languages, fall into only 3 types. Verb, subject, object languages, subject, verb, object languages, and subject, object, verb languages. English is a subject, verb, object language, so the order of the different types of words are used or put into that grammatical structure. And basically we know that if languages share typologies, they're also easier to learn. So people don't have this great confusion when they're actually trying to learn another language if they're learning a language that shares the linguistic typology. Just kind of a curiosity of the languages spoken around the world. We know that basically as native language speakers, Mandarin beats out all of them, Spanish, then English. But as far as second language learners, more people speak English than any other language in the world. And this is probably, it's projected to last at least for another 40, 50 years. So yes, Chinese, Mandarin is on the run, but it's actually not going to replace English for quite a while. Okay, so now let's turn to the development of language in human beings. And be careful, all the information that we're sharing right now has to do with, a typical or an average brain, which, that's very hard to actually qualify. But this means that there's some outliers there. There's some people with, extremely higher levels of intelligence. There are people with some learning disabilities. So basically what we're talking about right now would be an average. So if we want, we'll talk a little bit about language problems at the end of this particular presentation. So given an average brain, we know that about 90-95% of right-handed people and 70% of left-handed people have Broca and Wernicke's area in the left frontal and parietal cortex. So basically, there's a lot of talk about the left hemisphere dominance for language, and that is true. I mean, the majority of people in the world do have these key language areas in the left hemisphere. However, 5 to 10% of right-handed people and 30% of left-handed people don't. So when we talk about we can't really just say, yeah, language is a left hemisphere activity. We know that's definitely not true. And we'll look at some examples of those exceptions at the end. Basically now, babies who are born premature babies, we can actually even scan and estimate how they already perceive phonemes, and they can hear different voices. So we know that language perception happens probably around the 5th month of gestation, as hearing actually kicks in the womb. And we need to clarify here something about critical versus sensitive periods for language. Here's a question for you. True or false? Are there critical periods for first language? Are there critical periods for second language? And if there are or there aren't, does this apply to all the aspects of language? For example, understanding language, being able to speak and reading and writing. Are there critical periods for any of those elements? And basically, yes and no, okay? So there's no such thing as a critical period for a second language or a third language or a fourth language. Just as there's no critical period for any other academic subject, there are sensitive periods for that. And we know that the order in which skills are learned is far more important than the age of the individual. However, we do know that we can presume that there is probably a sensitive period for one's first language. We're not really sure because there's so few studies out there. Deaf population, stroke victims, feral children, Romanian orphans. There's very few of these incidences, thank goodness, but it doesn't give us 100% proof to say that there is a critical period for your first language. However, the evidence that's out there is rather strong. We know that so there's no critical period for learning something like math or for reading or for writing, but there may be a critical period for speaking your very first language. To illustrate that, I'd like to show you a quick video of a girl who was brought up by dogs, and to see exactly, so you can get a sense of where her language abilities are after having spent almost 6 years only in the company of animals. Hang on just a sec.
Oksana Malaya began her life living with dogs. Rejected by her mother and father, she somehow survived for 6 years, living wild, before being taken into care. There are few cases of feral children who have been able to fully compensate for the neglect they suffered. Oksana is now 22, but her future still hangs in the balance. Have scientists learned enough from previous cases to rehabilitate her? For 6 years, Oksana Malaya spent her life living in a kennel with dogs. Totally abandoned by her mother and father, she was discovered behaving more like an animal than a human child. For 2 centuries, wild children have been the objects of fascinating study. Raised without love or social interaction, wild or feral children pose the question, what is it that makes us human? Since Oksana's discovery, scientists have looked for clues in the handful of other recorded cases of feral children in their efforts to rehabilitate her. She's made astonishing progress in ways that many thought impossible. And now, aged 22, Oksana wants to take an extraordinary final step, to be reunited with the parents who neglected her.
I want to see them with my own eyes so desperately, because I've been told I have no parents. But actually, I do have them.
One of the central questions in all of science that has to do with humans is, are we a product of our genes or are we a product of our experience? The old nature-nurture issue.
Feral children tap into this because they are the natural experiment that we're not allowed to carry out. Part of being a human is being brought up by humans. If you're not brought up by humans, are you completely human? And I think In some of these cases, that's the issue that we're dealing with.
The case of Oksana Malaya has brought up these issues all over again. The doctors attempting to rehabilitate her first wanted to learn the facts of her story. The information was sketchy. Oksana was born in November 1983.
When the baby girl was born, she weighed 5 pounds 11 ounces and didn't have any abnormalities.
Her parents were alcoholics. One night, too drunk to care, they left their daughter outside. Looking for warmth, the 3-year-old crawled into the farm kennel. She curled up with the mongrel dogs that probably saved her life.
Mum had too many kids. We didn't have enough beds, so I crawled to the dog and started living with her. I would talk to them, they would bark, and I would repeat it. That was our way of communication.
A concerned neighbour finally reported Oksana's case to the authorities when the girl was 8. By then, the effects of her time with dogs had had serious consequences for Oksana's development.
She was more like a little dog than a human child. First of all, she couldn't speak, or she could hardly speak. And actually the purpose of speaking, well, she didn't think it was necessary to speak at all.
When we're talking about how does a child learn to live with dogs, there's obviously no deal as such, but there's give and take. So the dogs are giving their love, their attention, their acceptance in a sense. And what the child must give is that they've got to learn to adapt to the dog's situation. And if that means eating raw meat and scavenging a rubbish tip, that's what they're going to have to learn to do, because otherwise they're not going to survive.
She used to show her tongue when she saw water, and she used to eat with her tongue and not her hands. She couldn't understand what a mirror is. And when she was showed a mirror, she didn't even recognize herself. She didn't even look at it.
Oksana's lack of self-awareness makes her, in some respects, more like an animal than a human.
We presume that cases like this one indicate to us, even if a child has had human language, this child, for example, had language for 3 years, then she was isolated for almost 6, and then was reintegrated into society. So it's fascinating to see that with that early exposure, she was able to learn basic language. There are other feral children cases where they actually find that if they were abandoned from birth, they didn't have these initial years of early contact. They never managed to come up with language, even if they're only away or separated for shorter amounts of time. But apparently there is a key moment or key moments in these early years where there needs to be early language exposure. Sensitive periods are now basically replacing almost all aspects of what we consider is human development, except for probably what would be this first language and some gross motor skills. We also know that learning occurs throughout the lifespan, but we can, if you haven't learned to read when you're 7, you could do it when you're 17 or 27, or even cases of people who are 70 who learn to read. So we know that you can and do learn across the lifespan. Okay, so let's look at some key learning or language milestones for children. We know that there's first signs of communication, and this is not language, or is it language, okay? First signs of communication are when a child will cry, communicate to the parent their needs, they're hungry, they're wet, they're tired, they're cranky, and then children begin to actually coo and to imitate others, and by 6 months of age, we know that babies can actually recognize the sounds in their native language as compared to other languages. There's a wonderful video, a bit too long to watch. It's about an hour-long lecture. It's wonderful, though, if you have the time, which is recommended here on the slide. Given these main milestones, when a child will begin to speak around first words around a year old, by around 9 months of age, a child will actually recognize their own name, but this quickly multiplies, and by the time a kid is around 3, you'll have more than 500 words, and that's in spoken sense. There's a far greater number of words that a child will understand but not actually use. Some of the milestones that are suggested over the first 5 years, and 5 years is kind of like this kind of bookends that we offer here, because by the time a kid hits 5 years old, you can really have a great conversation. Most kids 5 years old know all parts of grammar in their native language or languages. To actually illustrate that, let's look at a couple of the main key stages of language development, a little two-minute video for you.
Look at language development, it's really goes along with brain development. So if language is progressing normally, then I'm happy that the baby's progressing normally. But let's go through some of the stages of language development. And this is usually babies start making noises around 3 to 5 months, and this is what they're going to sound like then. So Luke understands that. That's cooing. That's just, it's all vowel sounds. Just cooing and singing, and that's kind of what babies do from 3 to 5 months. And then at 6 months, they're going to add consonant sounds to that cooing, and it's going to sound like this. Da da ma 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 ma, those kind of ga 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 ga, those kind of sounds. And then the next step will be around 12 months, maybe a little earlier. They'll actually get a word or two, and it'll sound like this. Mama. So by 12 months, we want a baby to actually at least have one word. Oftentimes dada or mama, not the babbling, the mama, 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 but mama. They're talking to mama, and that way we know they're actually picking up the language. Then the next step after that, age 2 to 3 years.
Why you're a big girl? Why you're a big girl?
So do we have to worry about Luke's laugh line?
Yeah, really. Luke's gonna need some Botox.
And then after that, it's. The next stage is, can I have the keys to the car? And I'm not coming home tonight.
Yeah, that's the, so by age 2, we want to have at least 2 words together. Want cookie, milk please, bye-bye mama, things like that. And if you ever see regression, the baby was talking and now is not, or if they don't have any words at all by age 15 months, those are 2 danger signs to definitely mention to your pediatrician.
Mentioned in that short video, sorry for all of the clicks back and forth. We hope that the child has a few words by about the first birthday, 1 to 3 words. We see that this actually goes and begins to actually explode really quickly. By the time the child is 2, 3 years old, there's great communication happening, even if these are only in short sentences, 2, 3 words together. And what's fascinating, Atkinson actually points out that there's the explosion of language is actually phenomenal. By the time a kid hits around 3.5 years old, they have over 1,000 words in their vocabulary. And by the time the kid is 6 years old, he'll be expressing, probably using, 4,000 to 14,000 words. And that's a huge variety there. But this has a lot to do with language stimulation in the home, as well as in early school contexts and other social contact the kids have. But they actually understand almost twice or more than twice as many words as they actually use. This is actually quite impacting, and most kids actually use far fewer words than they actually know because they can get away with it, kind of law of minimal effort kind of a thing. They don't need more words. They can communicate their needs, and that's enough, so they basically don't use that many. Kids who basically get through high school, this is a figure for British kids, they'll have around 40,000 words. And then if they do university, if they go through university, they can have between 50 and 100,000 words. And those are actually used words. We know that there's almost there are twice as many, around 200,000 words actually used by an average college graduate. Okay. We're going to look at how social context, school settings, actually does change the brain, and what would be the stimulus that we'd ask you as parents, and also you as teachers who are working with small kids. What can you actually do to actually fortify language in small children?
The ability to use language is one of the things that makes us human. Language is the backbone of human society. It allows us to share the joy and pain of everyday life and to share knowledge and culture across generations. While other species cannot learn human language even with years of intensive training, all humans, with the proper input, are able to acquire and use language with little effort. Children pick up language at an amazing rate. By the time they are 2 years old, most children already know many words, and some know as many as 500. By the time they are 4 years old, most children are able to understand and use language in much the same way adults do. Of course, a child isn't just born with a language ready to go. As with the other brain systems we've talked about, a child's early experience builds the areas of the brain that support good language skills. For most people, the brain areas most involved in language processing are the frontal and temporal areas of the left hemisphere. This is true whether a language is spoken or whether it's a signed language, like American Sign Language. Signed languages like ASL use the same brain systems and show similar patterns of development as spoken languages. The role of experience in shaping the brain systems important for language starts very early. Evidence suggests that a child starts learning something about language while still in the womb. Studies have shown that at birth, babies already recognize their mother's voice on the day they are born.
For the first several months of life, babies really are incredible language learners. They can actually tell the difference between two sounds from any language in the world. That's something that neither you nor I can do.
It's in the first 9 months of life that we see how important language experience is for children. This is when the language children hear from their parents and others allows them to zero in on the sounds in their native language. But it isn't just the sounds that infants are hearing. When they hear the same language sounds from a recording, from a CD or TV, they don't zero in on those sounds like they do when the sounds are coming from a live human interaction.
So the social interaction between parents and children, not just the sounds they're hearing, is very important for children's development of language. And as children are zeroing in on the sounds of their native language, they also begin to understand that we use different words for different things and actions in the world.
Soon, children are learning several words a day. Even before they can speak, children understand a lot of language. Babies who are only 8 months old show a preference for words they have heard frequently in stories. We actually use the techniques described in the introduction to see how the brain changes and becomes more adult-like as children begin to understand and use the structure of language more like adults do. But these brain changes do not happen automatically when children reach a certain age. In fact, the changes we see in the brain only happen when children actually learn more words and more complex sentence structure. And this is where the experiences a child has are very important in shaping early language learning. Some very interesting research has shown just how important the right kinds of language experiences are for building good language skills. Researchers have found that children whose parents talk to them more often and with more adult-like words and longer sentences have larger vocabularies and are better able to use and understand more advanced language structure.
Look at his face. Look at how round his face is. That's perfectly round.
But it isn't just the way parents talk to their children that is important. Research conducted in the Brain Development Lab at the University of Oregon looked at the language skills of children whose parents were in a special program. This program taught them to encourage their children to talk a lot and to make a special effort to listen to their children and take turns when they had a conversation. These children, compared to children whose parents did not get this training, had improved language skills after just 8 weeks. And it isn't just parents. The language experience children have with other adults is important too. Another study looked at children in classrooms with preschool teachers who used longer and more complicated sentences in their speech than other teachers did. and found that these children were better able to use and understand longer and more complicated sentences after just 9 months. Reading and sharing books is another very important type of language experience, which helps build good brain structures for language. Many studies have shown the importance of reading and sharing books. Children whose parents share books with them every day have larger vocabularies and better language skills than children whose parents don't share books with them as often. As the world continues to become a smaller place, many people are finding it important to be able to communicate in more than one language. Being able to speak more than one language is a very valuable skill which helps children in many ways.
While many people think it's not a good idea to start teaching children a second language when they're very young, a lot of research has shown that this isn't the case. It's okay, it's even a good idea, for children to start learning more than one language at the same time. In fact, most findings suggest that when it comes to teaching a child a second, or even third language, the earlier children learn, the better.
Children won't become confused with more than one language, and in fact, they will speak a second language better, and with less of an accent than children who start learning a second language at a later age. This also means that children who are primarily learning English at school, but who may hear other languages in the home, will be just fine switching between the two languages. So it's okay and even a good idea for a child to speak one language at home and a different language in school. So the recent move in the United States towards teaching foreign languages in elementary school, or even preschool, is a positive step in helping children prepare for the future and is well supported by research. So just as we have seen in other segments of this DVD, for language learning, there seems to be a sensitive period when it is easier for people to master a second language, especially the sounds and structure of that language. Remember, research shows that all of these differences in language knowledge, from the words and structure of a first language to learning a second language, mean differences in a child's brain structure. These research results show that the experience that parents and other caregivers give children with language early in life will have a profound and lasting impact on the child's brain. So what does this research mean for you as a parent? How can you provide the type of language experience for your child that will lead to better knowledge and use of language? Well, the research reviewed here suggests that there are several things you can do with your child which will help. Talk a lot with your child, and don't be afraid to sometimes use more complex language than your child is using. When your child asks you a question, try to give a full explanation and ask your child questions to encourage a discussion. Read to and share books with your child every day. Consider encouraging your child to learn a second language as early as possible. There are a lot of resources in our society, such as books, playgrounds, and school programs where your child can get exposure to a second language. So, as with the other brain systems we've talked about, the evidence suggests that there are optimal periods for the effects of language experience on brain development. For language, this evidence suggests that the rule is the earlier, the better.
For the cut in the video. So the earlier the better, especially for foreign language introduction, the earlier the better. We know of studies of kids brought up in trilingual environments, 4 languages, 5 languages, just fine. So we'll talk about that in the second video to come. Basically, very important element to understand, especially when choosing books to read with kids. We know that in the early years, the type of vocabulary that's developed with really younger kids, below 2 more or less, is heavily reliant on nouns. They spend a lot of time learning nouns. It's fascinating to see that basically with parents or adults, this actually switches and the emphasis goes to verbs, equally balanced with nouns and pronouns. So there's a change in the type of language that's used across the lifespan, and that age-appropriate books are actually very important when parents are selecting or teachers are selecting the types of things to read with kids. Okay, so shifting gears a little bit, let's look at how we, the concept of actually inner speech or inner language, thinking about words to thinking in words. Do you really think in words, or do you actually think in concepts or in blobs or images? The concept of using inner speech as a way of developing consciousness is actually something that's been discussed for centuries. Even there's talk of Plato, or there's writings related to Aristotle that actually make reference to that. Is the little voice in your head actually something that is equal to your conscious, how you talk to yourself about different things? This has been written about a lot. Vygotsky, probably one of the better known people on this. More recent work by Steven Pinker also shows the importance of inner thought or inner language. Some of the other points, more recently, there's been an attempt to try to understand whether or not meaning is understood before there's an understanding of the syntax, understanding of the structure, and then how word strings come together to produce speech, or is that a whole loop that goes backwards and forwards? And we do know that as well, that there's speech and then there's word strings, and that's understood by other people, and the meaning is gleaned. So this is a two-way street. We also know, going back again to Vygotsky, is that there's a belief that age-wise, that first there is speech is used actually to make a link with others. It's a social connector, right? So the mother goes blah, 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 and the baby goes blah, blah, blah. So there's a link there. And then apparently this dies down, and you don't see the kids talking so much out loud. What's very interesting is that Ph.D. actually thought that this was sort of a maturation. The brain gets connected enough. We don't need to say things out loud to basically understand ourselves. Whereas Vygotsky had this other vision, is that basically you go from, there's an inner development of concepts and external speech to society, and then actually this gets internalized and becomes actually more and more sophisticated the older one gets. And so Vygotsky, and perhaps this is the benefit he had of having Russian, he actually made a big distinction between what is sense of the word and what is the meaning of the word. And what he basically conceived is that we might be using the same words, but as we mature and as we see different uses for that same word, our general understanding, the sense of that word actually grows. And so we might make reference to the same single word, but it's not just that word that we mean when we're connecting things. So some people actually say, well, they don't think in words, they think in concepts. Well, this is very much coherent with Vygotski's idea, is that basically that sophistication of the understanding of that word has grown so much that, yes, you are using that word, but it's related to a lot of other concepts as you grow older and you actually link that word to other meanings. So basically, Vygotsky believed that there was an egocentric speech. We start off internally, we become more aware of others, we begin to speak externally, and then we stop speaking out loud every time we need to, when we're thinking, and we actually have this inner speech, which he believes continues to develop throughout the lifespan. This means, basically, this idea of this concept, the sense versus meaning idea, is that not necessarily are you actually thinking in a word, but you're thinking of all the meanings attached to the word. So many people might say, oh no, I don't think in words, I do think in concepts, but basically this is coherent with this idea that you actually are thinking in those words, which have expanded to embrace a lot of other concepts. In general, Vygotsky related to language, there's a lot of great things that we can take from his studies. We know that children construct their own knowledge. We know that the development can't be divorced from social context, as we saw in the case of the poor girl who was brought up by dogs. If there is no social context, then there is no development of language, or at least appropriate development. Prior concepts influence how we learn new concepts, and that language plays a central role in mental development. And this great belief that perhaps the limits of your knowledge, or what you can know, it might be constrained by the words that you have to actually express what you know about your world. We're going to have a quick look, about 5 minutes of what Vygotsky thought of related to language, and then about 3 minutes of what Chomsky's view is on language right now.
Now we revisit speech and language development. We have covered the basic assumptions of Vygotsky's theory of cognitive development, and now I want to focus specifically on the principles of speech and language development. According to Vygotsky, speech begins as a means of communication and socializing, and later becomes a tool of thinking. His research led to the identification of 4 major stages of speech development. The first stage is pre-intellectual speech. This is the first major stage of speech development. This begins with the infant's cry, which expresses, for example, hunger or discomfort. Soon, the infant begins babbling, laughing, and gesturing. These developments function as a means of social contact. The next stage is called autonomous speech. At around 12 months of age, the child begins to invent words. The child's invented syllables are an effort to communicate with adults. These pseudo-words are useful because they indicate an object in plain sight, and they can also facilitate limited communication with adults who understand the meanings. For example, a child may initially say ba for bottle, and then as she develops, ba becomes the word bottle. Our third stage is called naive psychology. This stage of speech occurs between 18 and 24 months when the child first begins to use adult words. The child learns that objects are referred to by name. As the child begins to name things, connections develop between words and objects. During this period, the young child's first expression is a simple word. For example, when the young child says, "Dada," it may mean, "Daddy, pick me up," or "Daddy, I'm hungry," and so on. As the child's thoughts become differentiated, she can formulate simple requests in the form of short and simple sentences. The final stage is communicative and egocentric speech. As indicated in the description of naive psychology, the child between 18 and 24 months begins to use adult words and rapidly expands his or her vocabulary. Subsequently, at about age 3, the child's speech splits into 2 types of speech: communicative and egocentric. Communicative, or also referred to as external speech, is for others, and the child at age 3 is able to use simple sentences such as, "I want milk." In contrast, egocentric speech is for oneself. From about the age of 3 to 7, there's a lengthy period of the development of egocentric speech. Egocentric speech often occurs in the presence of other children involved in the same activity, such as playing house together. It also occurs when the child is engaged in a practical tool-using activity. An example is a child attempting to get a cookie from the top of a cabinet. In these activities, the child's talk is a monologue. It is not intended to be a communicative form of speech. For example, our child wants to reach a cookie from the high cabinet. She may say to herself, "I'm going to push this chair and climb up to get the cookie." She's not necessarily communicating with anyone. She is simply stating these directions for herself. This is also referred to as self-talk. Self-talk guides a child through a task. During the preschool period, egocentric speech becomes increasingly abbreviated. Vocalization eventually ends, and egocentric speech moves inward as inner speech, or communicative speech. This is defined as the process of talking to oneself mentally rather than out loud. It is a silent form of verbal thinking. However, it does not become fully functional until after age 12. The psychological nature of inner speech is important because it represents the most advanced level of the relationship between speech and thinking. So in sum,
a quick 3-minute video on Noam Chomsky's view of language.
As in most sciences, especially the human sciences, almost every major question is open. So, for example, take the question, the 2 obvious questions. One is, how come there are any languages at all? I mean, a second question is, why are there apparently so many? these are pretty elementary questions, but they're sensible questions. Roughly, say, 100,000 years ago, which is almost nothing in evolutionary time, the questions couldn't be raised because there weren't any languages. Maybe 200,000, but roughly that area. So it's a sensible question. One is the question, how did languages suddenly emerge in the evolutionary record? And it's pretty sudden by an evolutionary framework, the amount of time involved. And then how come they proliferated? How come there isn't just one? Well, there's steps towards answering that. There's progress, I think. My own view, I should say, is pretty idiosyncratic. It's not widely held. But I think we understand enough about the fundamental computational basis of language to see that to develop a kind of a plausible scenario for how there might have been a reasonably sudden emergence of the fundamental nature of language, and also of why the apparent diversity is pretty superficial. So that if, say, a Martian was looking at humans the way that we look at, say, frogs, the Martian might conclude that there's fundamentally one language with minor deviations. And I think we're moving towards an understanding of how that might be the case, and it is pretty clear that it has to be the case. The time of development is much too shallow for fundamental changes to have taken place. And we know of no fundamental changes. So a child from a hunter-gatherer tribe and Stone Age tribe in, say, the Amazon, brought to Cambridge and raised here will go on and become a quantum physicist at MIT. There's no known differences in relevant cognitive capacities. So there's something fundamentally the same about all of us, and it's whatever emerged pretty recently. And we have to work out to show that the enormous apparent variety is a kind of superficial variation, and also to explain how it might have suddenly appeared in the evolutionary record.
Well, Chomsky and others believe that basically, language appeared relatively recently in human history. There's a huge distinction that they all agree upon, and that is that oral language, maybe there's a genetic disposition for speaking and all the rest of that, but when it comes down to reading and writing, these are less natural abilities. There's nothing actually natural about this. And people like Stanislas Dehaene and Marianne Wolf point out that this is actually something that is really recent in human history and really not a natural thing for the brain to be able to do. Stanislas Dehaene himself came up with this concept of neuronal recycling. Basically, there are new cultural tools that we're faced with. For example, the ability to write is something that actually benefits human beings. So what could have happened? I mean, is it possible that there was this great evolution in being able to connect with written or symbol systems very quickly? And he believes, well, that would be illogical to presume that. So a second theory might be that basically due to the plasticity of the brain is able to adapt really quickly to this. But since it's actually taken much longer, remember we mentioned in week 3 something related to the Baldwin effect. Basically, it's something that's beneficial to a species that's repeated over time, then after many generations could actually be manifested in genes. And he places this idea into a concept called neuronal recycling, in which parts of the brain that might have been used at some point, hundreds, thousands of years ago, millions of years ago, to actually, scan the savannah for the enemy or for a tiger or a lion running at you. This is not necessarily needed in today's world for most people. So they basically, parts of the brain that might have been used to actually see that have actually been adapted now to for the use of reading. So this is a fascinating concept because it might mean that since it's such a new function in the human brain, it could explain why there's so many problems with reading difficulties or with symbol systems in general, dyscalculia and all the rest of it. For those of you who have time, I would really highly recommend that you watch this video of Stanislas Dehaene's intervention in a wonderful, quite quick speech that actually explains the brain and language, especially as it relates to symbol systems and particularly reading. There are many language circuits in the brain. As we saw in the very first one with Dr. Hirsch, there are many overlapping neural pathways that are used to complete language in the brain. There are different neural networks for viewing things that are different from listening to words, which are different from speaking, which are different from generating verbs, which are even more far different from what would be reading and writing, which we'll see in just a minute. Let's just look at the very first 4 stages really quickly, a couple of really key examples of how language development looks over the first few months of life, so that we can actually, as you watch this video, it's only about a minute long, but if you can think about the different things that are going on in that kid's head, it's just not one piece of the brain that's actually lighting up for language, but there's all of these very intricate networks which are developing during this stage.
Cheese, I'm not taking pictures, I'm recording you. Cheese. Yeah, say cheese. Say I love you. Say where are you? Say stop it. Can you say banana? Nana. Can you say apple?
At first sight, these things look very normal, natural. These look like things that seem very easy. However, if you think about the intricacies that are happening in the brain, it's very, very complicated. The way that these circuits are actually solidifying, the way that this networks are actually growing, very, very difficult if you rather actually look at what's going on inside the brain, not just the way it's manifesting in behavior. So we know that there's different stages, we know there's different things that are going on, we know that there's different networks that are actually getting together to actually produce language, speech, and then moving on to a bigger stage, which would be reading and writing. Well, we know, and this also goes for multilingualism, it's quite easy to learn to speak. It takes between 1 and 2 years to actually learn to speak another language, but when it comes down to reading and writing, it's a very, very different network. We now know, because technology is actually advanced, we're able to actually see that it's not just, we once believed that there were simple circuits that were happening. You could see a word and then you would actually identify the symbol system, and then you would actually be hearing this. Even if you're not saying anything out loud, you've got a phonological loop going on in your head. We're actually hearing something. Then you're able to produce this, and this comes out as speech. We now know, because of imaging technology, that it's a far more complicated task, the things that are going on in your brain as it reads another language. And this again is Stanislas Dehaene's work. So the neural pathways for reading can actually be broken down into, up to today, and I would say that this is probably going to change, there are 12 neural pathways that are necessary for reading, plus 4 affective pathways that I was able to identify based on the work of all these other wonderful researchers. First, we need to be able to pay attention, the use of executive functions to pay attention to what is being read. There's a need for a physical ability to actually see the word. The ability to generalize, conceptual understanding, which has to do with different symbol systems which represent the same concept. For example, the different representations of 3, or the Roman numeral 3, or the Arabic 3, or 3 dots. The ability to mentally sound out words in one's mind, verbal coding. The ability to convert phonemes into words, so the k-at into cat. the ability to search one's memory for the right word, so vocabulary recall, the ability to understand the meaning of the word, so semantic understanding or semantic memory, the ability to correctly order the words. So this is syntactic, structural design of the words so that they actually make sense to other people. The ability to associate context with appropriate prosody and intonation. So being able to say, if you say, I'm pregnant, I'm pregnant, I'm pregnant, I'm pregnant, same word, but the intonation actually changes the concept there. Number 10, the ability to unite all of those pieces and put it into a coherent sentence, either written or spoken. The ability to unify sentences into a whole paragraph and then take those paragraphs and to create what would be something long written text. We also know that there's a big influence in the affective nature of learning anything. So the way the child feels about the learning process, if he's made to feel badly about his attempts to read, we know that has a huge influence and delays in learning to read. How learning to read might impact his or her social status. So if they're prized for that, or if they're given recognition at the local library or something like that, we know that that's very positive reinforcement to get kids to actually read more. We also know that there's a really huge ping-pong relationship between the teacher and the student. What the student perceives the teacher is feeling, what the teacher is now, gauging as they go along the teaching process. Well, how far can I actually push the student? What does the student really need from me to actually, take on the learning? So we know that there's a huge influence on the way that the student and the teacher's relationship influences learning. And finally, motivational factors, which also impact his ability to read well. So if you're told, these can be extrinsic motivating factors or intrinsic motivating factors, but we know that different kids will learn at different paces for different reasons and all very personalized. So we know that there's at least, in each of these 16 different concepts here, relate to a different neural pathway. So we know that there's a huge complexity of things happening in the brain as it's learning to read, and they include all of these different elements simultaneously. We know that we count on, for example, different types of memory systems, declarative knowledge, procedural, conceptual. We also need to have different types of estimation skills, symbol interpretations, and also physical skills, either graphomotor skills or things that have to do with speech. So all of these different things combine to make reading incredibly difficult or incredibly complex in the brain, but not nearly as complex as writing. Writing is even one step further. So we know that reading circuits of the brain are highly complex. They are highly interactive, and if even just one of these pieces isn't, working at top speed, we do have either delays in reading or we do have actual reading problems that will occur. Lots of work here that actually identifies, and all of these are showing, as we said before, the typical brain, this is all left hemisphere imaging here that we're showing, but not necessarily, this won't actually be the case for all readers. Let's see here. Okay, so we also know that the brain is reacting differently when it hears high-frequency words or low-frequency words or words that it's actually used to. So as you've seen in other things with Dr. Hudson, the brain actually works less when it's used to doing something. Once it's learned something, it actually slows down and there's less activity. For example, you'll see here in the middle, the brain is kind of going crazy trying to figure out when it reads non-words, when there are words that aren't real words, but the brain is trying to put it together and figure out, well, how come I don't recognize this? So there's a lot more activity going on when it reads non-words. And also there's activity going on when there's low-frequency words that the brain isn't used to seeing. But the top picture you'll see where there's high-frequency words, there's less activity happening because basically the brain's more used to what's it's perceiving. We know that reading, lexical access, frequency of exposure, all of these things have different impact on the way the brain scans look. So if you have the word in your lexicon, there's going to be less action going on. If you are frequently exposed to the word, then it goes down. Also, the activity goes down with a higher frequency. We know that there's different areas of the brain used for listening as opposed to reading. So these are different types of scans that will occur. And we also know that just listening to other things versus reading, you'll see this, it's also right and left hemisphere will also be lit up, but there's also overlapping pathways. So one of the things that's very important to take away from this is that while we say that there might be these 16 different neural pathways, there are many that are very similar and somewhat overlapping, especially in memory systems, for example. Writing is even more difficult than reading. We know that writing occupies more brain real estate than almost anything else, and we don't know for sure which exact areas of the brain are actually executing a lot of the writing, but we do know, for example, in the absence of certain areas of the brain, we know that there is a lack of writing, so we're going to presume that area of the brain is very important for writing, but we're not actually sure yet. Spelling is different from writing. Spelling is kind of a sub-element of being able to write. We actually know that when somebody has a problem, for example, on the left-hand side, two individuals, there's damage to different regions of the brain. The brain on the left, there's a difficulty in recall between letters and sound. And the person on the right has difficulty in actually spelling, the mechanical spelling of the words. So we know that even though they seem like they should be the same execution in the brain, we see that there are actually different things happening in the brain between spelling and actually writing the brain. We know also that emotionally charged words stimulate other parts of the brain in addition to semantic recall. They also have an emotional element to them. So basically, with all of these different pieces in mind, there's this question that was posed by Jeffrey and Goldenberg that was actually, well, so what parts of the brain are used in language? And they said, why don't we just say what parts of the brain are not used? Because that would be easier, because almost the entire brain is lit up as you're going through these different language processing, especially in the writing mode. And as we'll see in the second video, writing in a foreign language actually uses more parts of your brain simultaneously than almost any other activity that's been documented to date. The last section we're going to look at right now has to do with specific language impairments, or what problems can happen related to language. To do this, I'd like to sort of give you a quick introduction through a BBC video, and we're only going to look at the very middle section of this video, but should give you a general global idea of the importance of language, and especially as we start to have a look towards foreign languages.
Yeah, up a touch, please. Ready? Okay, go.
This is the challenge: to uncover what's going on inside 1.5 kilos of pulsating brain, with its network of 100 billion nerve cells. I've known neurosurgeon Henry Marsh for over 25 years. But this is the first time I've seen him at work. The first time I've been face to face with a living human brain. Standing next to Henry, peering down at the surface of the brain, it is incredible to think that these nerve cells somehow create the human mind.
We all think of mind and matter as being separate things, but it is very extraordinary when you actually see the brain, and particularly if you operate upon it. And if you think, I am actually operating upon thinking, I'm operating upon feeling.
Today, Henry is going to remove a tumour from Sarah Kitchen's brain. It's a delicate operation, because the tumour is near a region of the brain that is involved in language. Damage a vital area, and Sarah might never speak again. To avoid this happening, Henry has to do something extraordinary.
They've been going now for about an hour, and the critical phase is coming where they're going to have to remove the tumour. In order to do that, Sarah has to be awake.
If you have a general anaesthetic and go into an operating theatre and have somebody operating upon your brain, it's jumping into the deep end with the blindfold on, and you hope you're going to come out the other end in one piece. But if you're actually awake while it's going on, there's a much greater sense of control, and in a way you're part of the team. What we're going to do now is we're going to get you counting and talking when I touch your brain with an electrode, so we can just work out where the speech area is. Okay?
Sarah, can you squeeze my hand?
Once Sarah's awake, Henry begins to pinpoint the crucial speech areas.
What's your name?
By using tiny pulses of electric current,
he can jam temporarily the mental activity going on at a particular site in her brain.
Do some counting for me. I want you to count up to 10 and then back down again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. That's great. That's great.
It wasn't that she knew the number 5, but couldn't actually say it. She could think the number 5, but couldn't think of it as a number, so to speak. I mean, it's different. One's not paralysing the vocal cords. One is actually paralysing the mental processes that turn a concept, a thought, whatever you want to call it, into a word. Carry on.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10.
Go on counting.
1, 2, 3, 13, 14, 15.
Okay. Wash, please.
Well done.
Sarah, thank you very much. Sorry to
Sarah.
play games with you.
It's such a bizarre experience. Talking to Sarah about her favourite recipes, while Henry is prodding around in the very thing that makes her who she is.
I have on the other day that I absolutely love, like the panna cotta, the ricotta cheese and the spinach and a nice light pastry.
Still slightly drunk?
A little bit. Like that feeling.
Oh, you sound fine. It's nice to see you smiling. Everything's going really well.
It is actual living proof of the fact that thought is a physical phenomenon. And we're all so brought up not just by our parents, but by sort of thousands of years of culture to feel that thought is somehow as free as the air, it's mind as opposed to matter. But you actually see somebody talking on one side of the screen, and on the other side you see this blob of brain which is doing it. It's a very profound, thought-provoking experience.
I've spent 30 years of my life studying the human brain. And I'm still fascinated by the idea that this messy-looking lump contains all our secrets, our thoughts, and our feelings. But the brain is doing much more than we're ever aware of. We take so much for granted.
Of taking so much for granted, what are the things that can actually go wrong? So we know that there are certain types of language impairments, things that can be auditory discrimination problems, kid can't distinguish different sounds, receptive problems, expressive problems, dyspraxia, phonological programming deficit syndrome, lots of things that can come up that would be difficulties for children or for adults into their lifespan, which can be either caused by you can be born congenital problems, or they can be things that are acquired afterwards. Some specific language problems, in order to actually identify them, if they're not a temporary thing, it's basically they have to be interferences. It's a language problem that interferes with daily processes. We've excluded things that could be actual sensory perception problems, and that they actually have an impact on learning in other contexts. These would be sort of characteristics that we'd look for something that would be labeled a specific language impairment. Causes can be a huge variety. Some things can be genetic. We can have some other problems that are cognitive defects. You can have other things that are auditory deficits. There's different roots to these types of problems. Some language impairments that are not related to, for example, the left hemisphere typically. If you do have broken Wernicke's area in your left frontal and parietal lobes, you can still have other types of language impairments caused by difficulties in right frontal lobe processing things. For example, loss of prosody and perception. You can't difficulty in identifying emotions. You can't understand humor or metaphors. So there's a lot of other things that happen in different areas of the brain that are not purely left hemisphere related. We know that there is, and this is a great area for Dr. Peabody, she knows quite a lot about traumatic brain injury, especially as it relates to language difficulties. Things can happen with a bump on the head. You saw some things in Dr. Eamon's presentation related to football injuries, but a good bang on the head can actually cause a lot of these different language problems that we're talking about. One specific area of language deficit that's been documented for hundreds of years relates to aphasias. Aphasias are communication disorders. They can have to do with expressive aphasia, receptive aphasia. They can have to do with production of language, or they can have to do with actually finding or identifying the right words to actually produce language. We know that strokes can cause this. A blood vessel in the brain that can break, that can actually cause language difficulties. So in general, we associate aphasias with strokes, so they can also be caused by other things like tumors, as we'll see in a minute. Most common aphasias, Broca's aphasia, basically in Broca's area in the left frontal lobe. You can find this was identified in the first patient that Broca had. He could only say the word tan, 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 tan. Basically, he was unable to produce language. Whereas a couple of years later, Wernicke's aphasia, which is part in the posterior area, found that basically people will talk fluidly, but they speak gibberish. It means what they're producing actually doesn't make any sense at all. So they'll have a conversation with you, and they'll think that they're speaking perfectly, but what's coming out is a lot of mixed words. There's also recently been identified an area, Gershman's aphasia is actually the area linking Broca and Wernicke's area that actually has to do with speech production as well. Tumors can also cause aphasia. It's not just strokes that are the cause of aphasias. And the most common are basically Broca's aphasia, expressive aphasia, and also receptive aphasia and Wernicke's aphasia. These are different types of aphasias that have been identified. The inability to produce language. And now we'll move from aphasias to basically dyslexia. Shainwitz has kind of been like slammed a couple times because of this idea of overcoming dyslexia. You can never get rid of dyslexia, right? You can find some coping mechanisms, however. So what's suggested in her work has to do with a lot of coping mechanisms. We do know that there's differences in the way the brains are working. Basically, there's an overuse of certain areas of the brain because there's a lack of activation in other areas. There's also presumption that the communication, the natural communication between these areas is blocked. So dyslexics they do learn to read and write. However, they are probably using other systems. There's tons of literature out there basically showing how, not in dyslexic cases, but basically in aphasics, that there's a far greater use or recruiting of different areas of the brain, basically right hemisphere, basically, and symmetrical areas to recuperate language when it's lost. In terms of dyslexia, that's not the same case, but it's basically trying to find a different way to get the information into the brain because the natural pathways are blocked. And so you're having to find a new way to get literacy into your head. We know that plasticity is fabulous, but we're not actually sure what the extent of this is. There's a lot of research going on related to people with just half a brain who can speak just fine, and they, externally you don't see a lot of great difference. And even in some cases, for example, they find for this girl, for example, having lost, she was born without her left hemisphere, but her language was fine, her reading was fine, which I thought would be impossible. But so we know that other parts of the brain can be recruited for what would be a normal pathway. We don't know to what extent this occurs. We don't know how frequently it can occur. There's tons of studies that are being done to actually try to understand why can this person not be able to speak clearly, and why can this person without even more of their brain be able to speak clearly? We just don't know that yet. So there's a lot still going on that needs to be answered. But it's very important to actually identify that there are very big distinct areas of the brain that are being used. There are no two brains identical in the way that they are connecting language, though there are clear pathways that are typically used for these different elements of language. The last little piece we're going to have here as we transition into the next video about bilingualism and multilingualism has to do with bilingual dyslexic. For example, fascinating cases. In Japanese, you have 4 alphabets, right? You have Romanji, which is the Roman alphabet. It's A, B, C, D, right? Then you have katakana, which is basically used for things that are foreign words. Hiragana, which is kind of like a script. And you have kanji, which are more like pictographs. And it's fascinating to find with Japanese aphasics, people who typically should be losing language, they might lose one of these alphabets or another, or they might lose all of them, but sometimes, generally, if they're going to lose the kanji, they didn't lose the hiragana, katakana, and romanji, and vice versa, which is actually fascinating, but it makes us think that probably that the kanjis might be stored in a different area of the brain because they are related more to conceptual imagery as opposed to symbol systems that we don't, have a good reason why, A should be A. That the physical drawing of that doesn't make a lot of sense to a lot of people. Whereas, if you have, Nihon, which is Ni is the sun, and it looks like the sun coming up in your window, so it's a pictograph, it might be stored, it is stored in a different place in your brain, but we still don't really know that for sure. The dyslexic brain, presuming that there's reduced activity in the posterior area of the brain related to dyslexics, we're not exactly sure why or how, and it's not true in all cases. When you're reading in different languages, we do see that there's different use of different parts of the brain, sometimes depending on whether they're pictographs or not. And for example, in some recent studies on Chinese dyslexics, which also the Japanese use the symbol system of the Chinese, right? We sort of stole that from the Chinese. There are some people who actually say that dyslexic Chinese brain is different from a dyslexic Anglophone brain. It's very curious that the use of the Japanese brains is interesting because they do have both symbol systems as well as the pictographs. So still a lot of exciting research going on in that area, but we don't have all positive answers. Okay, so now we're going to close this section. What did we try to do? We tried to look at the historical or evolutionary perspective of why humans have language in the first place. We looked at some definitions of language, and we looked at the developmental processes of language and some key milestones. And we also looked at certain language problems, including dyslexia and aphasias. Now we're going to turn to this second video, which has to do with multilingualism. And we're going to look at a lot of the myths about multilingualism, as well as at least 10 key factors that influence successful multilingualism or bilingualism in school contexts as well as within the home. Thank you very much.